Have you ever had a neighbor who seemed just a little too strange? Someone whose presence made you feel uneasy, even when everything around you seemed normal? Well, this is the story of a neighbor who wasn't just creepy. He was something far worse. It all started on one quiet evening. I had just moved into a new apartment, and like everyone else, I was adjusting to my new surroundings. The place was nice enough, peaceful, calm, the kind of neighborhood where you wouldn't expect anything out of the ordinary. But then I noticed him, my neighbor. At first it was subtle, a glance out the window at strange hours, an unusual tapping sound in the middle of the night. Nothing too alarming, just enough to make me wonder. I brushed it off at first. After all, everyone has their quirks, right? But that was before I experienced the first incident, one that would shake me to my core. But before I go any further, let me just say, if you enjoy stories like this, filled with eerie mysteries and true horror, make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The apartment complex I moved into was nothing special. 3 stories, a few dozen units, and a quiet neighborhood. The kind of place you would expect to see families coming and going, kids playing outside, and neighbors exchanging polite greetings. At least that's what I thought. My apartment was on the 2nd floor, with a balcony that overlooked the parking lot. From my window, I could see the old, slightly worn-out buildings around me. It was quiet during the day, and even quieter at night. The kind of place where you could forget you even had neighbors, until you noticed them. And that's when I first saw him. My neighbor, Mr. Miller. He lived in the unit right next to mine. At first I didn't think much of him. He kept to himself, didn't talk much to anyone, and always seemed to be home alone. His apartment was dark, the blinds always drawn, and I couldn't remember ever hearing any sounds coming from inside. But one evening, as the sun was setting and the neighborhood was slowly quieting down, I saw something that caught my attention. Mr. Miller was standing on his balcony, staring directly at my window. His expression was unreadable, and there was something off about the way he stood there, motionless, just watching. At first I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe he was just looking out, lost in his own thoughts. But then I noticed something chilling. His gaze didn't move. Not even when I turned away to make dinner or when the wind started to pick up. He stayed there like a statue, staring. I felt an uneasy chill creep up my spine. It wasn't normal. But what could I do? I didn't know this man, and I didn't want to make assumptions. Still, something didn't sit right. But the next few days, things would only get stranger. It wasn't long after the balcony incident that I started to feel like something was off. At first, it was just little things, noises coming from Mr. Miller's apartment at odd hours, a faint tapping sound that would echo through the walls during the night. But I convinced myself it was just the usual creaks and groans of an old building. After all, every apartment has its quirks, right? But that night, everything changed. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up to a loud bang. It sounded like something heavy had fallen in the apartment next door. At first I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was probably just Mr. Miller moving furniture or something. But then, there was another sound. A series of sharp knocks followed by a dragging noise like something or someone was being pulled across the floor. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe he was rearranging things, or maybe it was just my imagination running wild. But as the minutes dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Then it happened. There was a sudden, frantic banging on my door. I jumped, my heart racing. I had no idea who it could be, especially at this hour. I glanced through the peephole, but all I could see was the dim glow of the hallway light. No one was standing there. I hesitated for a moment before cautiously opening the door. That's when I saw him, Mr. Miller, standing in front of me, his face pale and his eyes wide with panic. He's in there, he whispered, voice trembling. You have to help me. Please. I stared at him, unsure of what he meant, my mind racing. Before I could ask any questions, he turned and bolted down the hallway, disappearing into the night. Confused and more than a little freaked out, I decided to check on him the next day. But when I knocked on his door, there was no answer. I heard nothing from inside, just silence. What was he talking about? Who was in there? And why had he been so terrified? But this was just the beginning. The next few days felt like an endless cycle of unease. I couldn't stop thinking about that strange encounter with Mr. Miller. Why had he been so frantic? Who was he running from? And why hadn't he explained anything before disappearing into the night? I tried to put it out of my mind, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt a gnawing sense of dread in my gut. I started to hear things from his apartment again, those odd noises in the middle of the night. But this time they were louder, more frantic. The dragging sound, the thumping. It was almost as if someone, or something, was pacing back and forth in there, growing more agitated with each passing hour. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. So, I waited until the dead of night, when the building was completely silent, and then I decided to do something I'd been too scared to do before. I went next door. I stood outside his door, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear muffled sounds from inside, low whispers, soft tapping, and then something that made my blood run cold. A faint scratching sound as if someone was trying to get out. I knocked, but there was no response. I tried the handle, and to my surprise the door opened, just a crack but enough to see a sliver of the dim light from inside. I pushed it open slowly, my hand shaking, my mind racing. What I saw inside, I don't even know how to explain it. The apartment was a mess, furniture overturned, papers scattered everywhere, but that wasn't what struck me the most. No, it was what was in the corner. A figure, a shadow. It was hunched over, its back to me, but I could see its hands, clawed, twisted, and scraping against the wall. I froze, and then it turned. Its eyes, those eyes, cold, empty. They were staring directly at me. Before I could even process what I was seeing, the lights flickered and went out. The door slammed shut in my face, and I was left standing in the hallway, gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest. What had I just seen? Who or what was in there with him? I had to know. But I was terrified. This was far beyond anything I had imagined. The next day I couldn't stop shaking. My mind kept replaying the image of that figure in the corner, its eyes locking onto mine. I didn't know what I had seen. Was it real? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? I had to know the truth, even if it meant confronting the nightmare head-on. I decided to go to Mr. Miller's apartment once again, but this time I didn't knock. I didn't wait. I had to see for myself what was really going on. I grabbed a spare key from the landlord's office, one that I knew would unlock his door, and made my way up to his apartment. My hands trembled as I inserted the key into the lock. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, immediately hit by the musty, stale air. The apartment was eerily silent, far too quiet for a place that had seemed so alive the night before. I made my way through the darkened rooms, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. As I approached the bedroom, I noticed something strange. On the floor, scattered around the room, were old photographs. They were all of Mr. Miller, but something was wrong. In each one, he was standing next to a figure, someone I didn't recognize. Their faces were obscured, blurred, as if someone had tried to erase them from existence. And then I heard it, a soft, low whisper like a breath against my ear. "Help me." I turned, but there was no one there. I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred, my heart raced as I stumbled back toward the door. But then I froze. The door to the closet was slightly ajar, and from within I could hear something scraping, the same scraping sound I had heard the night before. It was louder now, more frantic. I couldn't just leave. I had to see what was behind that door. With a shaking hand, I reached for the handle and pulled it open. What I saw next will haunt me for the rest of my life. Mr. Miller was inside. But he wasn't alone. The figure, the one from the corner of his apartment, was there, standing over him, its face hidden in shadow, its arms wrapped around his neck. He was gasping for air, struggling to breathe. And in that moment I realized this wasn't just a man. This was something else, something that had been pulling the strings all along. The thing turned its head towards me, its eyes glowing in the dark. And then it whispered, "Now, you're mine too." I ran. I ran faster than I ever have in my life, out of the apartment, down the stairs, and out into the cold night. But I couldn't escape what I had seen. I couldn't forget that whisper, and every night I still hear it, echoing in my mind. But I'm not the only one. I never went back to that apartment. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those eyes glowing in the dark, watching me. The whisper still echoes in my mind. "Now, you're mine too." After that night, the building became a place of nightmares. I moved out as fast as I could, but even now I can't shake the feeling that it's following me. I don't know what happened to Mr. Miller, or that thing that had been lurking in his apartment. Maybe it's still there, waiting for someone else to come too close. I don't know if it's over, or if I'm just waiting for the next time it calls my name. So, if you ever hear scratching noises in the night, or if a neighbor starts watching you a little too closely, just remember, sometimes it's better to stay away. And if you like this story, make sure you subscribe to hear more chilling tales like this. You never know what might be lurking just around the corner.
Have you ever had that feeling that something isn't quite right with your neighbor? You know the one? The uneasy sensation that creeps up your spine when you're alone in your house at night and you swear you can hear someone watching you? Well, let me tell you, I've had the misfortune of experiencing that very thing. It all started with little things, barely noticeable at first, but they escalated fast. The strange glances, the eerie silence from next door, and the odd noises that seemed to come from the walls at night. I didn't want to believe it at first. How could I? But soon enough, the truth became undeniable. What I thought was just a quirky neighbor turned out to be something far darker. This is the story of my creepy neighbor, an encounter that still haunts me to this day. It all began when I moved into a small, quiet neighborhood. The houses were old but well kept, and everything seemed perfect at first. I had always enjoyed the peace and calm of suburban life, away from the noise of the city. But then, there was my neighbor. He lived in the house next door. An older man, quiet, kept to himself mostly. His name was Mr. Gray, and I rarely saw him outside. At first, I thought it was just a personality thing. Some people prefer to be alone, right? But as time passed, I started noticing small things, odd things. His curtains were always drawn, no matter the time of day, and I could never seem to catch a glimpse of him, unless it was late at night. One evening, I happened to be in my living room when I saw a shadow moving behind his window. It was subtle, almost like someone trying to stay hidden. The weird part? There was no light on in his house, yet the shadow moved across the window. It was like he was watching me, or maybe waiting for something. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Little did I know, that feeling would only grow stronger. The first real incident happened one rainy evening. I had just finished dinner and was relaxing on the couch when I heard it. Soft, rhythmic tapping against my window. At first, I thought it was just the rain, but as I listened closer, I realized it was a distinct pattern. Tap, 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 followed by a pause, and then another set of taps. I stood up to investigate, but when I peeked outside, there was nothing. My heart started to race. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the wind or some random noise. But then I heard it again, this time from the direction of Mr. Gray's house. I couldn't help myself. I had to look. I slowly walked across my living room, glancing out the window, trying to see if there was anything unusual. That's when I saw him. Mr. Gray was standing by his front door, staring directly at my house. He wasn't moving, just standing there, completely still, his eyes locked onto me as if he knew I was watching. His face was expressionless, like he was waiting for something. The eerie thing was, the porch light was off, but I could still make out his figure in the darkness, almost as if he was blending into the shadows. I quickly backed away from the window, my mind racing. What was he doing? Why was he standing there, staring? It felt wrong, unsettling. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made me jump. I knew something was off, but I had no idea how much worse it was going to get. After that night, things only got stranger. Over the next few days, I noticed Mr. Gray's behavior becoming even more unusual. He stopped leaving his house during the day altogether, which wasn't entirely odd, but it was still unsettling. His lights never turned on at night either, at least not that I could see. Yet sometimes I would hear strange sounds from his house, muffled noises that sounded like dragging or scraping, like furniture being moved around. But it would happen at the oddest hours, always late at night, when most people were fast asleep. One evening, while walking to my car, I noticed something even more bizarre. Mr. Gray was standing in his front yard, but this time he wasn't facing his house. He was facing my house, staring at the windows with this unsettling, vacant expression. His hands were at his sides, but his posture was rigid, almost like a soldier at attention. What made it worse was that the moment I noticed him, he didn't move, didn't blink, just continued staring as if I wasn't even there. I quickly got in my car and drove off. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. The next morning, things took an even darker turn. I had left my front door unlocked the night before, and when I went to open it, I noticed something strange. A piece of paper was wedged under the door. I bent down to pick it up, and it was a note, written in thick, almost frantic handwriting. It simply read, "I see you." That was it. No signature, no explanation, just those 3 words. I don't know what made me more terrified, the note itself, or the fact that Mr. Gray's house was dark, with no sign of movement, as if he had never been there at all. It wasn't long after the note that I couldn't take it anymore. The constant feeling of being watched, the strange noises, the way Mr. Gray's presence seemed to linger in the air. It all became too much. I had to confront him. I don't know what I was hoping for. Maybe an explanation, maybe a reason to dismiss all the unsettling things I'd been experiencing. But deep down, I knew I had to face whatever it was that had been haunting me. One evening, I finally mustered up the courage to walk over to Mr. Gray's house. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the front door. The neighborhood was eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making every step feel heavier than the last. I knocked, my hand shaking as it tapped against the weathered wood. For a moment, there was no response. I stood there, my breath shallow, wondering if he'd heard me. Then, the door creaked open slowly. Mr. Gray stood in the doorway, just as still and expressionless as before. But now, something was different. His eyes were wide, almost unnatural, and his skin was pale, like he hadn't seen the light of day in weeks. He didn't say anything at first. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the air thick with tension. I felt a chill run through me as I noticed that the inside of his house was completely dark. No signs of life, no warmth or comfort, just an empty, hollow space. Finally, he spoke, but his voice wasn't what I expected. It was low, raspy, like he hadn't used it in years. "You shouldn't have come." His words sent a shiver down my spine. Before I could respond, he stepped back, slowly closing the door, but not before I caught a glimpse of something strange, a shadow moving in the corner of the room. It wasn't just a shadow though. It was a figure, tall, thin, almost contorted, like something was lurking behind him. I froze, unable to move, my mind racing. Who or what was that? And why was Mr. Grey trying to keep me from seeing it? I quickly turned and ran back to my house, my heart racing in my chest. The air felt thick, suffocating, like the world around me had suddenly become distorted. My mind was in a frenzy, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. What was that thing in Mr. Grey's house? And why had he tried to stop me from seeing it? I barely slept that night, my thoughts consumed by the unsettling encounter. The next morning, I knew I had to find out more. I waited until the sun was setting, then snuck back to Mr. Grey's house, hoping to catch a glimpse of something, anything, that could explain the horrors I had witnessed. As I approached his house, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door was wide open. Without thinking, I crept inside. The air was stale, thick with dust, and the house felt strangely empty. I moved quietly through the rooms, my footsteps echoing in the silence, until I reached the hallway. That's when I saw it, an old cracked mirror hanging on the wall. I couldn't resist. I stepped closer to it, and as I looked into the reflection, my breath caught in my throat. Standing right behind me, just inches away, was Mr. Grey. But something was terribly wrong. His face was twisted, distorted, as if he was not really him at all. Before I could react, I heard a voice, low, guttural, and not from Mr. Grey's mouth. It whispered, "You shouldn't have looked." The reflection of Mr. Grey began to smile, but it wasn't his smile. It was wide, unnatural, and his eyes, they weren't his eyes. I turned to run, but the house seemed to shift around me, closing in. The walls stretched, the doors vanished, and the darkness swallowed me whole. I don't know how I escaped, but when I stumbled out into the daylight, I was no longer in Mr. Grey's house. I was somewhere else, and I don't think I'll ever be able to leave. So that's the story of my creepy neighbor, Mr. Grey. I never saw him, or the house, again. But sometimes in the dead of night, I hear that same tapping sound against my window. And when I look outside, I swear I see a shadow, standing still in the darkness, waiting. I don't know if it's him, or if it's something else entirely. But one thing's for sure, some things never truly let you go. If you've had an encounter like this, or if you want to hear more stories like mine, don't forget to subscribe. Stay safe and keep an eye on your neighbors.